On a grey, overcast morning steeped in quiet mourning, Remy Thornfra sat on the dock of the community lake, his young daughter by his side. The fishing rods lay still in the water, lines stretching like fragile threads of memory into the depths below. It had been just 3 weeks since Rachel, Remy's wife, had passed away after a grueling battle with cancer. The lake had always been a sanctuary for their family, a place of peace, laughter, and healing. Sitting beside his daughter, Remy was not seeking rebellion or spectacle, only a brief escape from the crushing weight of loss. But that fragile peace shattered when Karen Wellington, the notoriously rigid and self-important president of the Homeowners Association, marched toward them with her clipboard clutched like a weapon. She delivered a curt and officious citation for violating a new restriction: unauthorized use of the lake. Remy was stunned. The rule had never existed before, not in the decades he had lived there, not in any HOA newsletter. When he asked for clarification, Karen simply smirked and said the bylaws had been updated recently. Within a week, he received an official fine of $500. The letter was cold, impersonal, and felt more like a slap in the face than a legal notice. It wasn't just about money. It was an assault on dignity, an insult to grief, and the first shot in what would become a bitter war. Unbeknownst to Remy and the rest of the neighborhood, Karen's sudden imposition of lake restrictions was no arbitrary flex of power. It was calculated. Behind closed doors and beneath a veneer of civic responsibility, Karen had been negotiating with the financially strapped developers who still retained partial rights to the land. Her plan was audacious: to acquire the lake and surrounding green space at a discount, rezone the area for residential development, and sell it off for a tidy profit by constructing a row of luxury homes marketed to outsiders. Her vision of the neighborhood had no room for grieving fathers or nostalgic weekend anglers. She saw dollar signs where others saw memories. To execute her scheme, she needed to eliminate public use of the lake and squash potential opposition before news of the sale broke. Karen began weaponizing the HOA rules, instituting selectively enforced penalties for long-time residents she viewed as obstacles. Community gatherings at the lake were abruptly shut down. Birdwatchers were threatened with trespassing charges. Even children were forbidden from swimming, all under the guise of safety. Slowly, she was trying to erase the lake from public life, hoping that by the time her plans were revealed, no one would care enough to resist. But she underestimated the deep emotional bond the community had with the lake, and the stubbornness of a man like Remy Thornfra. The $500 fine served not just as a punishment, but as a rallying cry. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about Remy's confrontation with Karen, and soon others began sharing similar stories of sudden fines, inexplicable rule changes, and humiliating reprimands. Merrick, a retired teacher, had received a citation for hosting a book club on her back porch, apparently noise complaints. Samuel, a veteran and wheelchair-bound resident, had been fined for parking his accessible van improperly, even though he'd parked the same way for years without incident. At first, these stories had been told in hushed tones, in living rooms and over fences, but now, emboldened by Remy's resistance, a core group of residents began to meet regularly at a local cafe, comparing notes, sharing documentation, and building a case. What emerged was a pattern of abuse, one that extended far beyond petty fines. Karen had been exploiting her role, using the HOA's resources to target dissenters and silence critics. Together, the group launched an initiative called Neighbors for Fair Governance, creating a website, distributing flyers, and calling for a community meeting. They weren't just resisting fines, they were exposing a system that had enabled a power-hungry despot to manipulate the rules to serve her private interests. Remy, once a reluctant leader grieving in silence, found himself at the center of a growing movement. As the group dug deeper, Remy learned something astonishing. The lake wasn't fully owned by the HOA or the neighborhood. The original developers, facing bankruptcy, still held the lease to the property, but had quietly listed it for sale to resolve debts. Karen had discovered this months earlier and had been quietly negotiating, intending to close the deal under a newly created LLC. But Remy, using contacts from his former career in finance, was able to obtain the same information and act swiftly. With the support of the community behind him and a considerable portion of his own savings, he arranged a private transaction. On a humid Thursday morning, while Karen was at a planning meeting sipping lattes and plotting her next move, Remy wired $350,000 in cash to the holding company. By noon, he was the sole legal owner of the lake and its surrounding acre of green space. The deed was signed, notarized, and filed. Karen was still blissfully unaware, preparing decorations for her sunset social, a lakeside gala intended to impress potential investors. Remy didn't stop her. He waited quietly, letting her invite the community she had spent months alienating to an event on property she no longer had a right to use. And then, when the sun dipped behind the trees and the music swelled, he made his entrance. The air was thick with the scent of catered hors d'oeuvres and rose-scented candles as Karen mingled among the crowd in a flowing sundress, speaking in hushed tones about upcoming neighborhood enhancements. Music played from rented speakers, and lanterns floated lazily on the lake's surface. Then, with deliberate steps and a manila envelope in hand, Remy strode across the lawn. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Karen's smile faltered. Remy stepped onto the makeshift stage near the dock and tapped the microphone. "Good evening," he said. "Before we go any further, I need to clarify something. This event is trespassing." Gasps echoed from the crowd. Karen rushed forward, hissing threats, but Remy held up the deed, read aloud from it, and declared himself the new legal owner of the lake. The silence was absolute. Effective immediately. He added, "This property is closed to all HOA-related functions. You are no longer welcome here under the guise of entitlement." As the implications sank in, guests quietly began gathering their things, embarrassed and confused. Karen, red-faced and sputtering, tried to salvage her dignity, but no one was listening anymore. In one stroke, Remy had done what months of petitions and meetings couldn't. He had shattered Karen's illusion of control and reclaimed the heart of the community. In the weeks following his dramatic takeover of the lake, Remy Thornfra transformed from reluctant rebel to community champion. But rather than revel in his victory, he rolled up his sleeves and set to work. With support from volunteers across the neighborhood, many of whom had once felt powerless, Remy initiated a sweeping plan to restore the lake's ecosystem, which had been neglected for years under the HOA's oversight. He contracted environmental specialists to assess the water quality, remove invasive plant species, and implement a sustainable plan to bring native fish populations back to healthy numbers. He installed benches, built a new dock, and repaved the walking trail that circled the lake, ensuring it was accessible for all residents. But perhaps the most radical move was his public declaration. The lake would be open to all members of the community for fishing, boating, and quiet reflection, except pointedly for families of current HOA board members. This decision sparked outrage from Karen's dwindling supporters, who called it vindictive, but for most residents it was poetic justice. The message was clear: exclusion would no longer be tolerated, but neither would corruption. As the lake returned to life, ducks nesting by the shore, children playing in the shallows, elderly couples walking hand in hand, the community began to see the water not just as a body of nature, but as a symbol of what they could reclaim when Karen Wellington did not go quietly. Desperate to regain control, she began spreading misinformation, claiming Remy had forged documents, that the purchase was illegal, that the restoration efforts were damaging local habitats. But the more she spoke, the more unhinged she appeared. Then came the final nail in the coffin. One evening, under the cover of darkness, Karen was caught on surveillance cameras dumping chemical runoff from her landscaping company into the lake. Whether it was sabotage, vengeance, or simply the final unraveling of a woman who had lost her grip on power, no one could say for certain, but what followed was swift and devastating. Environmental authorities launched an investigation. Criminal charges were filed. Civil lawsuits piled up. As the press caught wind of the scandal, reporters unearthed years of shady dealings, improper use of HOA funds, nepotistic contracts, and aggressive legal threats against residents who dared question her authority. In a single month, Karen went from untouchable to disgraced. She was stripped of her HOA position, fined heavily and publicly shamed. Her once pristine home, which had been a beacon of curated perfection, became a fortress of closed blinds and unanswered doors. The woman who had dictated the lives of so many now had no voice, no allies, and with Karen ousted and her inner circle either resigned or too humiliated to remain, the HOA was left in disarray. But rather than let it crumble, Remy and the group behind Neighbours for Fair Governance saw an opportunity to rebuild. They held open forums, true community meetings, not the kind Karen had run with rigid agendas and predetermined outcomes. Residents voted to establish term limits for all board members, ensuring no one could monopolize power ever again. A rotating ethics committee was created, composed of randomly selected homeowners who would act as neutral reviewers for any disputes or concerns. Transparency became the new standard. All budgets, minutes, and policy proposals were made available online. For anyone to review, decisions were made democratically. People who had previously avoided HOA meetings out of frustration or fear began to participate with enthusiasm, bringing ideas, volunteering time, and helping shape a neighborhood culture that valued inclusion and accountability. Under this new structure, the HOA became what it was always meant to be. Not a tool of control, but a framework for shared stewardship. Remy, offered the presidency multiple times, declined, instead acting as an advisor to help mentor future leaders. His goal had never been personal power. It had always been justice in a quiet ceremony attended by over 100 residents. The lake was officially renamed Rachel's Lake in honor of Remy's late wife. There was no pomp, no media, just a wooden sign unveiled beside the shore carved by Merrick's husband and a few heartfelt words from Remy himself. Rachel believed this lake was sacred, he said, voice trembling. Not because of the water or the trees, but because of the people who gathered here, who cared enough to preserve it. The renaming wasn't just a tribute, it was a statement of values, a line drawn against exploitation and greed. At the same event, Remy announced that he had signed over the lake and surrounding land to a community trust. The legal structure was airtight. No future HOA, developer or private party could buy or repurpose the land without unanimous approval from all homeowners. The trust was overseen by a council of residents from diverse backgrounds, ensuring its integrity. The lake, once nearly stolen, was now protected forever, owned not by one person but by all. As the sun set over the calm water and Rachel's name shimmered on the new sign, it was clear that something profound had taken root. Not just justice, but a legacy. Karen's departure from the neighborhood was neither dramatic nor dignified. Early one morning, a moving truck arrived at her house. Curtains twitched as residents watched in quiet satisfaction. By noon, she was gone. No goodbye, no farewell, just a bitter end to a reign built on fear and manipulation. But her absence left something behind: clarity. The HOA had become a mirror of what communities everywhere could be when people stopped accepting injustice as inevitable. The scars Karen left behind, the fear, the division, the loss, were slowly replaced by a renewed sense of unity. New leadership emerged, diverse, compassionate, and committed to transparency. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves began organizing events, planting gardens, and checking in on one another. Remy, though never seeking fame, became a symbol of grassroots strength, a man who had simply refused to look the other way. And in Rachel's Lake, fish darted beneath clean waters. Children laughed on sunny days, and the reflection staring back at the community was no longer one of powerlessness, but of hope. Justice had been served. And more importantly, change had taken root.